Chapter 118, The Quadrant. The season for the line at length drew near, and every day when Ahab, coming from his cabin, cast his eyes aloft, the vigilant helmsman would ostentatiously handle his spokes, and the eager mariners quickly run to the braces, and would stand there with all their eyes centrally fixed on the nailed doubloon, impatient for the order to point the ship's prow for the equator. In good time the order came. It was hard upon high noon, and Ahab, seated in the bows of his high-hoisted boat, was about taking his wonted daily observation of the sun to determine his latitude. Now in the Japanese sea the days of summer are the freshest of effulgences. That unblinking, vivid Japanese sun seems the blazing focus of the glassy ocean's immeasurable burning glass. The sky looks lacquered, clouds there are none, the horizon floats, and this nakedness of unrelieved radiance is as the unsufferable splendors of God's throne. Well, that Ahab's quadrant was furnished with colored glasses through which to take sight of that solar fire. So, swinging his seated form to the roll of the ship, and with his astrological-looking instrument placed to his eye, he remained in that posture for some moments to catch the precise instant when the sun should gain its precise meridian. Meantime, while his whole attention was absorbed, the Parsee was kneeling beneath him on the ship's deck, and with face thrown up like Ahab's, was eyeing the same sun with him. Only the lids of his eyes half hooded their orbs, with his wild face was subdued to an earthly passionlessness. At length the desired observation was taken, and with his pencil upon his ivory leg, Ahab soon calculated what his latitude must be at that precise instant. Then, falling into a moment's reverie, he again looked up toward the sun and murmured to himself, "Thou sea mark, thou high and mighty pilot, thou tell'st me truly where I am, but canst thou at least the hint where I shall be, or canst thou tell where some other thing besides me is this moment living? Where is Moby Dick? This instant thou must be eyeing him. These eyes of mine look into the very eye that is now beholding him. Aye, and into the eye that is even now equally beholding the objects on the unknown thither side of thee, thou sun." Then, gazing at his quadrant and handling one after the other in its numerous cabalistic contrivances, he pondered again and muttered, "Foolish toy, baby's plaything of haughty admirals and commodores and captains. The world brags of thee, of thy cunning and might. But what after all canst thou do but tell the poor pitiful point where thou himself happens to be on this wide planet, and the hand that holds thee? No, not one jot more. Thou canst not tell where one drop of water or one grain of sand will be tomorrow noon, and yet with thy impotence thou insultest the sun. Science, curse thee, thou vain toy, and cursed be all things that cast man's eyes aloft to the heaven, whose live vividness but scorches him, as these old eyes are even now scorched with thy light, O sun. Level by nature to the earth's horizon are the glances of man's eyes, not shot from the crown of his head, as if God had meant him to gaze upon his firmament. Curse thee, thou quadrant, dashing it to the deck. No longer will I guide my earthly way by thee, the level ship's compass and the level dead reckoning, by log and by line. These shall conduct me and show me my place on the sea. Aye, lighting from the boat to the deck, thus I trample on thee, thou paltry thing that feebly pointest on high. Thus I split and destroy thee." As the frantic old man thus spoke and thus trampled with his live and dead feet a sneering triumph that seemed meant for Ahab, and a fatalistic despair that seemed meant for himself, these passed over the mute, motionless Parsee's face, unobserved, and glided away, while, awestruck by the aspect of their commodore, the seamen clustered together in the forecastle, till Ahab, trebly pacing the deck, shouted out, "To the braces! Up helm! Square in!" In an instant the yard swung around, and as the ship half wheeled upon her heel, her three firm-seated, graceful masts erectly poised upon her long-ribbed hull, seemed as the three Horatii pirouetting on one sufficient steed. Standing between the knight-head, Starbuck watched the Pequod's tumultuous way, and Ahab's also, as he went lurching along the deck. I have set before the dense coal fire and watched it all aglow, full of its tormented flaming life, and I have seen it wane at last, down, down to the dumbest dust. Old man of the oceans, of all this fiery line of thine, what will at length remain but one little heap of ashes? Ay, cried Stubb, but sea coal ashes. Mind ye that, Mr. Starbuck, sea coal, not your common charcoal. Well, well, I heard Ahab mutter, there's some one thrusts these cards into thy old hands of mine, swears that I must play 'em and no others. And damn me, Ahab, but thou actest right. Live in the game and die in it. This is the end of chapter 118. So, Ahab had a quadrant, which is a contraption which allows you to measure the elevation of the sun. So you point one element of it at the horizon, and then you tilt the other one up until it's pointing at the sun. And this allows you to tell how far north you are, because if you do it at noon, the elevation of the sun will correspond to the latitude you are, how far north or south, depending on the time of the year, because the sun moves north and south over the equator. So at noon, on the solstice, the sun is directly above the equator. And at noon, at the equinox, at noon at the equinox, the sun is directly above the equator. At the solstice, it's directly above either the Tropic of Capricorn or the Tropic of Cancer. And so if you know the date and you can tell how far north or south you are based on how far the sun is up, because you have 22.5 degrees north and south for the tropics. So if you know the date, you know how far the sun has traversed either north or south. And so this allows Ahab to know just how far he is. And Ahab had a really nice quadrant, because there's some which are just like rough metal, but Ahab's had lenses, so he could darken it down, put in the colored glass so that he doesn't hurt his eyes staring at the sun. And this is one that apparently had some fairly dark glass on it, so that he could actually watch the sun for a couple of minutes without, blinding himself. Because during eclipses, people sometimes temporarily or even permanently blind themselves by staring at the eclipse, because an eclipse is such an awesome thing to see. So what you really should do for an eclipse and to observe the sun is you look at through a pinhole. So what you do is you take a sheet of cardboard, sheet of metal, sheet of whatever, something that's opaque, and you put a little tiny hole in it. And the little tiny hole acts as a lens. And so only the light that comes through the little tiny hole, and that gets projected on another flat sheet. So you have this light coming through a little tiny hole, and it expands the image once it crosses through the pinhole until it hits the sheet. And when it hits the sheet, you can see the sun, except because of the way that the pinhole works, it ends up flipped upside down. But you can see it flipped upside down, and you don't have to worry about hurting your eyes. Another way to view an eclipse or to view the sun is through thick, dark glass. And the recommended is welder's goggles, because welder's goggles are designed to block out all of the UV and most of the light. So you're able to observe the sun. Now, one time many years ago, there was an eclipse, a solar eclipse, and it was a partial eclipse where I was. And a partial eclipse is where only part of the moon, or the moon only partially blocks the sun. And because the moon partially blocks the sun takes on the kind of crescent moon shape. And what was really, really awesome, this was actually probably far more awesome than seeing an actual eclipse. Well, maybe not. I haven't seen a full eclipse with all the solar flares and all of that stuff. I've heard that's awesome. But what was really cool about this was that as I was walking along, there were leaves on the trees. And because there were leaves on the trees, each little gaps between the leaves acted like a little pinhole. So you had all of these leaves with all of these little pinholes projecting all of these little curved suns down on the sidewalk. So I looked down on the sidewalk, And there were dozens of these crescent suns just kind of laying on top of each other and next to each other, just scattered around. It was really sort of impressive to see. So, one of these days, there's going to be a solar eclipse near where you live. And, they happen every few years where the moon and the sun line up. So the moon lines up with the sun, and because the moon happens to subtend almost the exact same angle that the sun does, when the moon goes in front of the sun, you have it exactly blocked. So you can just see the corona of the sun. Or if the moon is just a little bit too far away, so it has a slightly smaller angle, then you have what's called an annular eclipse, or an annular eclipse. And annulus is the Latin word, it means ring. So you have a ring of the sun completely around the moon, which is also a very impressive thing to see. And sometimes when the moon just barely misses, just a hair off, you kind of have this sparkly gem ring sort of thing going on. But all sorts of really cool things can happen with eclipses. But Ahab didn't need Ahab didn't need the eclipse. He was actually trying to figure out where he was, to try and figure out where Moby Dick was. But he got frustrated with his implements because it could only tell him where he was and it couldn't tell him the future. So here he was, he went and he destroyed something that was expensive and, valuable, and he just smashed it up because he's frustrated. And, don't destroy things because you get frustrated. That's just bad. Yeah, I mean, wanton destruction is just it's not good. I mean, if Ahab's not going to get another one of those, I can tell you that right now. This is something that's expensive, and if he were to go back to, well, one, he can't get one without returning home, and that's like 9 months because a lot of time has passed at this point. That's like a 9-month trip back to either North America or Europe to get another one of these things. And he's going to be out there for another 4 years, maybe 3 years. He's going to be out there for another 2 years if everything goes right. So he is not going to get another one of these. And so he's just going to have to deal with looking at his logs and making guesses. And he's like, I'm just going to do that. And he wrecked something that was valuable and could have potentially saved his life. We don't know. It's a useful tool for knowing where he is, and knowing where you are is very important because the Pacific Ocean is a huge, huge place. And these islands, a lot of them are really, really small. And I mean, there are stories of people putting an island down on a chart and they get it wrong just a little bit. Their quadrant wasn't as good as Ahab's, or so they place the island and they say, okay, the island's here. And they were wrong about it. And these islands go missing for 100 years. The Mutiny on the Bounty, the island that they ended up on was placed on charts like 150 years beforehand, but nobody had seen it. And they're like, okay, we're going to mutiny and we're going to go to this island. And everyone was like, no, that island doesn't exist. And then and they managed to find it. And that island was lost for another 80 years before anyone else happened to find it. So Ahab has good charts, and he also used to have a quadrant. So if something happened, the boat needed to make land real quickly, there's a good chance he wouldn't be able to find that land he needed right when he needed it. But, just wrecking things out of spite is not good. I've seen people smash their phones. They get angry and they go, bah! Smash the phone down. And then they realize that they wrecked something that was expensive and important. So, it's take care of things because, you may not know when you may not be able to replace it. And so take care of things and respect the tools.